the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and I'm happy to welcome you to this presentation on understanding untouchability, an examination of 1,589 Gujarati villages. It will be presented by Christian Davenport, who is Professor of Peace Studies here at the Kroc Institute of Political Science and Sociology. Professor Davenport, as most of us here know, is interested in political conflict and violence, mostly as perpetrated by governments, by repressive regimes, and those affiliated with them. He covers a variety of kinds of political violence: genocide, mass killing, torture, curfews, beatings, domestic spying, and so forth. And he examines both the global patterns of this kind of violence and individual cases. Many of us are familiar with his work, his really path-breaking work in Rwanda, calculating, we saw a presentation here, a very impressive presentation, I think it was last year, on the genocide in Rwanda and rethinking responsibility on both sides for mass killing. He's also worked in the United States and India, as we're here today, most recently in Northern Ireland. And he employs a real range of methods and approaches to this study, from statistical research, ethnography, film, and his publications. I won't keep us here that long to review them with you. They're available for you, but it's across a wide range of topics around these basic themes, especially considering the impact of democracy and democratization on this question, and also the influence of military intervention, economic sanctions, naming and shaming, and other political and economic policies. If you haven't spent any time on Christian's website, I suggest you do. You'll get a little education there, just the various projects he's working on and has worked on, including the way in which he combines, we use together, scholarship and activism. If I got it right, there's scholarism is one of the terms there, which is the synthesis of the two. And you'll see a number of very interesting studies that he's worked on or is working on in that respect, on these topics. Today we're going to hear about a very interesting study of the Dalits in India, the Untouchables, and I want to thank Christian for, among many other things, bringing to the Kroc Institute last year Martin Makwan, who is really an impressive person. Martin worked with Christian in India on the question of untouchables and has said caste-based discrimination and untouchability practices cause suffering for 160 million people in India and another 80 million in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, Martin said. Martin is one of the founders of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights and was here as a visiting fellow through Christian's agency. And we're going to hear today about the study of untouchables in India that Christian, Martin, and others worked on. So please join me in welcoming Christian Davenport to talk about understanding untouchability.
Thanks, Scott. Today, I will talk a little bit about some discriminatory patterns that we are not that familiar with. The Untouchables, kind of a name popularized in many parts by Gandhi and his efforts. I had a tremendous amount of respect for Gandhi before I went to India and interacted with the Untouchables and the Dalits. That is the subject of another lecture, actually. He didn't really do that well by them in many respects, which many of them will tell you very quickly. But they're also known by a variety of other names, and thus I wanted to put these forward so we have some understanding of kind of what we're talking about. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what is untouchability and what explains its variation. And that is largely the trajectory of what we're going to do. In terms of thinking about untouchability, it's really hard to get your head around it. So there's new population estimates out about India. It's now 1.2 billion people. They're not quite sure how many untouchables there are because they don't really want to ask that question, and it hasn't been asked for several decades. But if you go from population estimates about 14 to 16%, that means about 192 million Dalits exist in India alone, and then there's untouchables within other locations as well. When you think about untouchability, you need to know that it's sanctioned by the dominant religion, Hinduism, in its most prominent texts, and simultaneously it is abolished by the guiding kind of legislations on discrimination within India, the Protection of Civil Rights Act and the Prevention of Atrocity Act. And if you actually look at the Supreme Court, they have some of the most progressive rulings you could possibly imagine on discrimination, and yet it's a practice that most would admit is ubiquitous throughout the society. And historically, it has been one of the most divisive issues, pitting Gandhi, and I'll ask, has anyone in the room not heard of Gandhi? Okay. Has anyone in the room not heard of Ambedkar? Okay, see, now we want to have like a nice quiz. Okay, tell me what Ambedkar is known for. Promoting the rights of untouchables and drafting most of the Constitution regarding minority rights. So not an insignificant figure, and is perhaps the most prominent untouchable leader of the modern era, and there have been quite a few. So today, I, in a sense, represent the tip of the iceberg. It takes, I guess this will be twice that I use the phrase in a day, it takes a village to conduct this type of research, and only one part of the village is here, but effectively we are a legions of sorts. Martin is many things. He is a lawyer, he is an activist, he is a anthropologist, he is a sociologist, and he's also the founder of this organization called Navsajan Trust, which is a human rights organization that pushes for Dalit rights. And one of the things that Martin did was systematically always start to kind of catalog abuses. He just knew something inherently was important about doing it. He didn't do it as well as he wanted to, and we meet later on through some other associates at the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights. They connected the two of us together. Robert F. Kennedy knew that I was kind of interested in systematically evaluating human rights abuses and assisting an organization in trying to advance its human rights struggle. It turns out that the one thing that Navsajan Trust wanted to know but really couldn't figure out how to know was what's working? What are we doing that's having an improvement in reducing untouchability and caste discrimination? And so very simple and straightforward kind of impact assessment of what different activities are working. What's working is the subject of another talk. This one's actually just kind of a little bit more formative. Dave assisted with much of the modeling of some of the stuff that I'm going to show you. Martin basically, there's an interesting kind of division of labor between kind of ethnographic work and qualitative scholars and quantitative ones. And normally people attempt to go out into the field and they understand what processes are actually going on involved on the ground, and they're trying to kind of figure out, get some general assessment of what's going on. And sometimes this feeds into developing questions to kind of address in focus groups, or that get pushed into kind of surveys or get used in sensi. Effectively, we were able to take advantage of the fact that Martin had 37 years worth of familiarization with about 3,000 villages that they ended up working in. So we were able to kind of utilize that to set up focus groups, to set up surveys, and to set up the census results that I'll talk about today. And so that was extremely useful. Al Stam came in at a later date. Al and I have a rather bizarre and torturous history, which I won't go into. And Manjula Pradeep runs Navsajan Trust now after Martin had stepped down. And all of us basically contributed to all parts of the project. I'm quite frequently the front person, and so I just wanted to identify that up front. As I said before, the purpose of the project is to understand untouchability. It's a 3,000-year-old practice. There's a tremendous amount written on this particular subject. There's not much rigorous work that's done, however, across villages and across districts and talukas and states in India. And Bekdar makes the comment, and I think it's very appropriate. India is not a country, it's a continent. And so whenever you think about India, you need to think about amazing variation. And this is one of the reasons why we focus in on Gujarat in particular. I'll talk about that later. And secondly, we wanted to assess the impact of anti-untouchability activity. Today I'll talk about the first part, but address the second only in passing later on. This is relevant to much of my other research, which is really about trying to move away from national aggregates of understanding conflict and contention and discrimination, and to really start to kind of go to the level at which these abuses take place, be they towns or villages or cities, but basically to try to get some understanding of what's going on from as local a level as possible. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is this untouchability? How do we measure it? What do we find in our investigation? What accounts for variation, which I'll do very briefly. And one of the reasons for taping this and doing this talk is this is like the outline for the book, so your comments will be very helpful on that one. And many of my colleagues that are on the project aren't really clear with what it is that I've been doing, and so this will be the first time that they see it as well, so this will be a good thing. When Martin was here, because he's Martin, he wrote one book, which he didn't intend to write, and he wrote another book that he did intend to write, and then he finally got to the third one that we were working on together. Martin also being Martin, he wasn't really good about kind of outlining which parts of the book that I should work on or that Alan should work on, so he kind of wrote the whole thing and then gave it to us and said, okay, let's now edit our book. So he wrote 3 books when he was here, and I'm still basically catching up to what it is that he did. But all of this said, none of those books were the books that we planned on doing at all. So he just wrote 3 completely different books, all relevant to the topic, all that will advance our knowledge, but not at all the one that, that I wanted to write when I first got involved in the project. And this will kind of move in that direction a little bit, and talk a little bit about kind of next steps from the project. Oh, hold it. I guess you're going to have to read it, because it didn't occur to me to hook this up to the mic. This is from a film that was put together by an organization that was associated with Martin's movement. And they had gone throughout 6 states in India on the topic of untouchability. And this rather interesting scene had these kids rather innocently talking about pollution, and they're not wanting to interact with Leelaben, this woman right there, and they're explaining that they're not going to come in there because they fear being polluted. And then she's like going to interact with them, and they're all kind of like hiding from her and pushing back a little bit. And the film was interesting because one of the things that you always come across when you mention untouchability within India, in many respects, the automatic reflex action is it doesn't exist. And then you push it a little bit, and you can identify one of the many practices that exist, and they'll be like, oh, you mean that? And then they'll go from there to be like, oh, yeah, that's there, but that's just one of these backward practices. And so what I found interesting about it was, so they approached this kid and they asked him, he said, are you a Dalit? Are you an untouchable? And he says yes. And they're asking him basically, do the kids come to your house? And he's like, yeah, they come to the house, but they stand outside. And then the kids they're beautiful, right? I mean, you wouldn't think that these are the kids who are sitting up there going, yes, I'll get polluted if I hang out with this guy. Yes, my life will be fundamentally altered if I were to interact with him. And then later on in the film, they actually interact with this kid who's basically got all his friends. All his boys are hanging out with him right here, telling him they're not going to hang out with him, they're not going to touch him. And then he reflects on what's untouchability. And this issue of what untouchability is and our ability to try to kind of communicate it, we've actually tried many ways to do it. So one of the things we became really fascinated with trying to figure out is, how do you communicate to somebody what untouchability is if they're not really familiar with discrimination or rural contexts or India? And so one of the things that I attempt to do, in part because you interact with a lot of kids when you're at Navsojan. Navsojan also runs a school. And in the school, you have these Dalit youth from all different parts of Gujarat. They're now expanding to other states. But they have all these kids that are coming from Gujarat. And while they're there, they're always like, so what's America like? And so I'm like doing my best to try to explain what America's like. Imagine that. So I pull out Monopoly. I'm like, what are you supposed to do? So I give them my warped sense of history, and then so a little bit of Monopoly, a little bit of Malcolm X, and you just kind of like put them together, and they come away with different parts of kind of what's going on. So in line with our conversations, I'm like, well, why don't we do a board game? So we're basically creating a board game to explain untouchability. Which comes out of all this academic stuff that I'm going to give you, but it's also directly related to the ethnographic work that Martin did. So the thing to know about untouchability is it affects all aspects of life almost. So it affects school, it affects how you're dead, how you go through the process of burying another individual, who gets to touch the body, where does the body get buried, who gets to be at the ritual itself. Whose death is celebrated by the village, whose is not. It influences what work you do. This was characterizing the practice of untouchables being responsible for the removal of human feces within villages. So there's money allocated by the federal government for flush toilets, but this money isn't hardly ever actually allocated and utilized towards that end. Most of the rural villages rely upon this particular practice. But the thing to think about is, simultaneously with this amazingly beautiful history, I'm not a great photographer. I'll admit that in a second. That's one of the first shots I took when I first went to India. Beauty just walks all around you. And at the same time, you have some subtle aspects of discrimination and racism. So this is a rampatar, and a rampatar is basically if an untouchable comes to your house, it's just part of the custom that you give them some tea, that you give them some beverage. Rather than actually touch the untouchable is supposed to reach into this area, grab the rampatar, and put that out. Then the person puts the tea in there, and then the person will sip the tea. The untouchable, they'll then watch it, and they'll put it back. But that's for them. This is I'm forgetting the name, but this separates the communities so that you know exactly which community that you're in. The untouchable part of the community is designated by very clear markers to identify exactly who is allowed to go into what location. And thus, you get this sense of the encompassing nature of the discriminatory practice, and that's one of the things that I'll talk about now in a little bit more detail. Every village that we went into, so all of the 1,589, I think when we started this, which would have been like 7 or 8 years ago, Google Earth wasn't as popular. I was just getting into GIS. And so we did some basic stuff, which was basically send people around and just kind of illustrate where everything is. The interesting way of kind of approaching it is whatever the parameters of the location or of the village are, you always look to the outskirts for the scavenger community or for where the untouchables are. They will always be on the outskirts of a community, never on the interior, never near the houses of government, and almost never around the water. In this context, there's a designated part of the pond that is designated for Dalits. The school, while everyone could attend, the Dalit children have to sit in the back of the room. I mean, much of this will start sounding familiar to you in a certain way. This was yet another one that we did. Obviously, this group spent a lot more time. That's you do what you can with what you have. But my grounding point for a lot of this is like, so ethnographically, I'm listening to people, I'm hearing what they're telling me in terms of the discriminatory patterns that they're subject to. I'm listening to their narratives of the different forms of discrimination that they deal with on a daily basis. Racism in America is like my first kind of grounding point, right? So this came from some piece, This came from a piece by this woman, Polly Murphy, who in 1949 identified all these different forms of segregation by state. And so you had amusement parks that were segregated, billiard pool, public halls, circuses. Circuses were segregated. Go figure. Agriculture and trade schools, separate libraries, toilets, mental patients, nursing, paupers, railroads, waiting rooms, and basically state by state went and tried to figure out exactly what was going on. What was interesting for me is when we first started to kind of bring together all the different elements of Untouchability, because part of our project was to bring together all of these disparate studies that had existed on the topic and try to be as comprehensive as possible. What are all the different forms of Untouchability that you can identify? Once I started looking at the list, this started kind of showing up, and I thought that was very interesting, but that's something that kind of kept coming back to me. So we engaged in this project, as I said, 7 years ago, and this evolved a tremendous amount. Part of the difficulties were that you had Martin, who I mentioned kind of represented all aspects of the social sciences, law, activism, and just this kind of like natural scholar, teacher kind of person. That's really cool. And then you have a bunch of like social scientists who are just like, you know, where's the data at? And how can we help you do what it is you wish to do? And then we have some social movement activists. And then we had some some human rights NGOs. And effectively, trying to get us all to speak the same language is probably what took about 3 of the first years of the projects. Because we all had different priors, we all had different objectives, we all had different methods, we all had different ways of assessing success and so forth. And so a large part of our project was to figure out what each of the parties were trying to get to. And so the first kind of 2 years, so I'd gone to, I think I've been to India like 12 times, and the first 2 years I went 4 times, and a large part of it was Martin lecturing me on what had actually happened in Indian history. And it was like, okay, can't we get to the, to explain something about myself at the same time, I'm like, can't we just get to fighting discrimination? Do I need the indoctrination? And anyone who's done field work realizes, yes, you do. And so I was more than willing to sit there and listen, and I learned a great deal, and then he has a voluminous library and started connecting me with other scholars that were in Gujarat. But by and large, we started to kind of push in this direction. Now, Navsojan, Martin's organization, works in 3,100 villages. And so the way we get to 1589 is actually kind of interesting because I'm generally interested in being as comprehensive as possible. There's like 14,000 villages in Gujarat. I'm greedy, they didn't give me any monetary limitations, so I said, let's do 14,000. And he was like, no, we can't do that. We need to be in the villages that we work in so that we can get some trust with regards to the information that we're getting from individuals. The objective was to basically conduct a census of all individuals that existed in the villages and ask them about what happened. I'll get back to that. But everybody in the village would be asked what goes on in the village. And then we realized very quickly that okay, we're going to get into some trouble if individuals outside of the Dalit community try to speak to individuals that are in the upper caste and ask them what's going on. That wasn't going to work, so that we got restricted to paying attention to what existed within the Dalit community. The 3,100, everything was going fine. So I'd worked out this great research design, and it completely fell apart when it got into the field. So of the 3,100, we were going to divide it equally, and then certain villages were going to be asked questions. But no, it gets even better. So you have the whole village, and you're just like, well, the women might ask questions or answer questions differently from the men. So we should randomly stratify by gender. So then you have half the population over here, then you have a third that are broken down into no divisions whatsoever. You just ask everybody. And then some you break down by gender, then some you break down by age, and then some you break down by subcaste. So far, great. Happened all well in the villages. We did that in about like 2.5 years. And then they started to do households. Okay, so this meant that you go to every Dalit household, and then you do the same thing. In certain households, you talk to everybody in the household. In certain households, you'd ask the men and the women separately questions. In certain households, you separate by age. In certain, the households didn't vary by caste. That did break down. They did about 300 villages and had about 25,000 respondents, and they were like, we can't do this. And so there's many tensions throughout the whole project. I will not say that the village was equally agreeable at all points in time. I'm like, you're messing with my research design, and I laid out this thing beautifully, and everything should function as we talked about it. Because I told you how the household thing was going to work. This is exactly how I pitched it to Martin. And Martin, in his very scholarly, fatherly, brotherly way, was like, but now you are here. And that's kind of like his response. And then they basically proceeded to do as many as they could before they stopped. Now, as we randomly determined which part of the population was going to be household and which part of the population was going to be village, this didn't impugn the design, I find out later on. But at the time, I was kind of upset. But so we move on to, we interact with Martin. I realize this is kind of small. We interact with Martin. And one of the things that became extremely important for us to do was to identify, well, what do we mean by untouchability and what kind of practices are we talking about? So Martin was convinced from his 30-some odd years of walking around these villages and talking to people, Martin was convinced that there was eight big categories of untouchability. There was untouchability concerning water, food, beverages, religion, touch, access to public facilities, prohibitions and social sanctions. He was convinced that there were these categories. Now, caste is very important in many respects because of this. It's something that exists by birth. It is something that exists, it's fundamentally about touch and separation and isolation. That is the element. That's what all the discriminatory practices are supposed to do, to separate distinct communities that by birth are believed to be separable. And Martin had these categories. Well, my thing was the categories might not exist. And this was like another 2 visits and another year as Martin and I were trying to hash out exactly what was going on. He suggested the categories existed, and I said, that's fine, but it might not. Because in principle, there should be some underlying untouchability. It's a latent measure. Untouchability, if it's a concept, then it should fit together. It might have subcategories, but they're all kind of representative of this thing known as untouchability. Now, this becomes important for us methodologically because if Martin's right and they're categories, then these should be evaluated individually. There's a water untouchability part. There's a public sanctions untouchability part. If I'm right and they're actually all related to one another, then we need to estimate it in a different way. It sounds like a small thing, but it took a year and far too much time to kind of pinpoint. But the idea was for us to identify every single practice, which we did, and then try to think through exactly what's involved. So village wells simply refers, there's an appendix on the webpage for the project that I could direct you to for more detailed explanations. Village wells, simply there is a well in the village, and you either are, as a Dalit, or not discriminated from using that well. Everything is dichotomous. It either exists or it does not. Is there a water pot in school? So there's water that's available in school. All children can use it or they can't. Dalits are discriminated or they're not. Everything's dichotomous. Touching food. If a Dalit touches food, are there any social sanctions for them touching that food? Yes or no? Occasionally there'll be a follow-up question. So if a Dalit touches food, is there some kind of ritualistic practice like lighting a match or putting water on it that will make it clean, that'll cleanse it? So they're not only practices of discrimination, there's practices of social isolation, there's sanctions for violating that, and there's also rituals for cleansing that. And all of these things are sanctioned by dominant religious texts and by different cultural aspects. So we come up with 100 different practices that exist. I will talk today about the 100 practices that exist between the so-called upper castes and untouchables, which we call vertical discrimination. But there's also horizontal discrimination because within the Dalit community themselves, they discriminate, actually. And so there's certain villages where the Dalit cannot use the barber of the non-Dalit community. Well, then there's a Dalit barber, but that Dalit barber themselves might discriminate against, they might not do vankers, they might not do people that are touching human feces, they might not cut their hair. And so there's some relationship between the practices that are displaced between these two communities, but actually the correlation is like 0.27. They're very independent from one another, which is interesting, but that's a separate piece. But what we did for each practice, what this represents very kind of directly, what we did for each practice was try to figure out exactly where did it come from. and we realized that over time, there have been different amounts of observation of the different practices. And so we went through every single practice and identified exactly who talked about what practice at what point in time to get some idea of consistency. And this became interesting because a tremendous amount of work on untouchability has been done by anthropologists. And so their ethnographic work helped kind of pull out a lot of these practices. Cross-validation, they're less apt to do, and thus we kind of brought that together with some legal scholarship, with some sociologists, with some political scientists, and it became this interdisciplinary thing where we didn't actually think it was, but some of the practices you won't see mentioned, WaterPeb, for example, and so we're still in the process of trying to figure out where the primary documents for each of these practices comes from. So as I said, we did 1,589 villages. Household and village level data collection efforts. We stratified by age, gender, and subcaste. In total, there's approximately 90,000 respondents. It's a 33-page census. And the duration varied from a couple of hours to a couple of days. Now, this sounds a little bit strange, and I will grant that it is strange. But imagine the setting. We've convened as a village of, so untouchables are what others call this particular group as outside of the Varna system. Dalits are those who are oppressed. Dalits are what they call themselves. And so I go back and forth, and I just want to explain that briefly. But so the Dalit community comes together in a village, and then they're like introduced by the local person from Navsarjan. They're explaining what we're going to do, and then we go through each question. So I just randomly grabbed a page. This is page 19. So all Dalit postmen received equally by all Dalits. And then we ask about village wells, and then we ask about all these other practices that I've mentioned before. All Dalit teachers treat equally. Dalit teachers are taught equally. This becomes very important. So we ask a question, and it's yes or no, or not available. And then we ask about the most practicing caste, and then we ask about the most victimized caste. Well, and we have all the notes from this thing, and so it's insane, some of them. So you have a meeting, there's like 150 to 2,000 people in a room who are talking about whether or not a practice exists. So initially, much starts off with denial. No, that doesn't happen here. And then someone will be like, what about Indu in 1975? And they're like, oh, okay. And then so they have these like long deliberations. Now, you break it down by subcaste, then we're separating out into however many subcastes are there. This process is repeated in isolation. As this is India, people get curious, and so occasionally we had meetings where the very people whose practices we're trying to evaluate, the upper caste, walk in and sit down, as they are wont to do. They feel that they own the village, so they feel they can go into anything, and we're not really in a position to tell anyone to leave, and no one wanted to do so anyway, and so we had to go back and forth, so I had to get them to actually include that into the code sheet. Oh, upper caste present. And which ends up being a factor in some of the modeling that we do later on. It turns out that it wasn't an effect, but I thought it was kind of interesting. I'm like, why don't you ask them to leave? And they just kind of looked at me because I repeatedly kept getting in these situations when I would ask for something that was completely disrespectful of the culture, and they just kind of smiled at me. We were like, we don't do that. And Martin would go, we are here. And so that just kept coming back. So what we do from the 100 items is we basically create a cumulative scale. And from the scale, this is all of Gujarat, from the scale we end up getting all of the, these are states, I believe. Well, these are talukas. Do you remember? These are talukas, thank you. We end up getting these talukas. These out here we have not gotten to, and this led to some interesting kind of methodological discussions. So you'd like to have villages that have no connection whatsoever with Navsarjan that we can compare them against. what I ended up doing is, of all of the other villages that are not within our sample, looked at various demographic characteristics to see if there's anything fundamentally different, to see if there was anything that was unique about our particular villages, which there wasn't. Navsarjan ends up going into villages on the basis of two different criteria. One is that there's a crisis, and Navsarjan is called and they go in. Normally it's some kind of atrocity. I don't talk about atrocities. I'm talking about different forms of discrimination. Atrocities out. I did bring some reading material that there are about the atrocities. The last one I will flag as being rather graphic, just so you know ahead of time. People are killed for untouchability violations and practices, and so this not to be kind of dismissed. And some other reading material that you might find interesting. But so they're brought into a village, one through a crisis, which could be, it's a somewhat old practice now, but this is actually something that's kind of historically important. There used to be a practice where a upper caste, so-called upper caste, could come to a household, remove their shoes and put them in front of the household and then step into the household, and then they could do whatever they wish with the contents of that household. That's with people or objects. As you can imagine, or as you should imagine, this actually involves sexual predation and rape. And if an individual came home, this is actually how Martin gets into the movement. So Martin, a friend of Martin's comes home, sees these slippers, goes into the house because he knows his mother's in there, throws this person out that was abusing their mother. That person leaves. They come back with the village, beat and kill this individual up. In that context, some organization like Navsarjan's would be brought in, and that would be a crisis situation. Now, in that particular village, so this is Ahmedabad. So in this particular village, you then, or that's the Taluka, which is one level up from the village level. But let's say you're in this particular village. While there, you're kind of like, let's move to the adjacent villages that are connected or contiguous to that one. So you can go into a village either through crisis or through contiguity. Now, these two processes become important for us as we're trying to figure out exactly what's driving the growth of the movement, but also what's influencing the likelihood that you may or may not be successful in an area. Now, within a Taluka, this is village level information. Our information is by village, or at least it is in this context. So for those places where we did households, we basically are taking a mean of all the households and generating a score for the village. And the places where we have village level information, this is already pretty straightforward. And so we see, sorry about the scale, yellow is bad, black or very dark is actually good, which if anyone knows me, they know I did that for a reason, but I won't go into that now. And so you see within this location and within these others, we have amazing variation within each of the Talukas, which is part of the point, right? So the development of subnational conflict studies is to actually get to this variation because that's the actual variation that exists, and we should not homogenize this whole unit because we have this variation. These places, the dark ones, are fine, relatively speaking, and what we need to do is start finding these clusters of horrible situations and try to address them as quickly as possible. Bless you. And so we have amazing variation across the 1589, and that was 5.5 years. It took 5.5 years to generate that. As time just zooms by, you're kind of going, wow, that's what I got for the 5 years. And so I kind of questioned it in many respects. So I was kind of like, wow, we finally saw the results. But what actually kind of pushed it in terms of its importance was when Martin went back to the individual villages and did presentations he didn't do all 1589, but they broke it up in the group. When they went back to the villages to show them, you're not alone, you're not in the worst, or you are in the worst situation, and now you're a priority. The information was used to basically create the priorities of Navsarjan, but also to push the government, to push various legal bodies to then engage in investigations, and now we could have the prioritizations of knowing exactly where we needed to pinpoint and push individuals. And so rarely as academics do we have situations where there's several thousand people interested in anything that you do, but that people were actually extremely excited about information, and it served as a mechanism for mobilization was completely astounding for me. So we use this measurement model to create the index. The only thing that is, these are all significant. The only thing that is less significant is actually religion. And what becomes interesting about this finding is that's because religious, these are all the different forms of untouchability. And so there's a bunch of forms that are around religion. Religion is low on this because religious discrimination throughout the 1589 is essentially ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Dalits are never allowed to go into temples. Dalits are never allowed to touch religious objects. It's like 98% prevalence across all of our villages. And given no variation, that doesn't show up. This allows you to basically see the subcomponents of the index to get some idea of exactly kind of what's really kind of having an impact. We see that those untouchability practices that concern touch, there's a very strong kind of relationship there, relatively flat with regards to water, not as important. We see the effect with religion is low, but there is still some kind of trajectory as you go up. You get some sense that the overall untouchability score is worsening. If you want to look at a single component of the index, these are all the things that concern touch. And the way that the graphic representation works, above the line means having effect on the index. So smoking a pipe has an effect throughout the index. This identifies that in those locations where individuals will not share a pipe with one another is consistently something that's present throughout the measure, as opposed to sprinkling of water from a Dalit body, which is a separate practice that's done to kind of engage in some kind of ritualistic cleansing. That's only prevalent after a certain level on the index. And what's interesting for us is that you could see amazing kind of variation between the different components of the sub-index that actually feeds or gives us the better understanding of the larger index, which was part of the thing between Martin and myself. Well, given the variation, the question then becomes, what's explaining the variation? And what accounts for better or worse situations of untouchability in different villages? And this is actually kind of, we have the village of scholars, right? And then we have the argument among the village about exactly what's driving it. And so different parts of our village have different arguments about what's driving it. And this also mirrors the literature rather well. So in many respects, untouchability is believed to be just a function of backwardness. It's just those people that are not as developed economically. It's just the geographically isolated. It's just these remote places that have no connection whatsoever with the outside world. There's also an argument that untouchability, as it's connected so strongly with Hinduism, untouchability would be caught with nationalist sentiment that pushes those elements. In places where you saw strong degrees of nationalist sentiment, you should see greater untouchability in these locations. And also you need an opportunity. You need a decent enough size of a group in order to engage in discriminatory practices. The fifth that's not here is anti-untouchability activism. We have some issues with regards to how that in particular information was collected within the census, and we're still trying to figure out how to get to that. But that's the variable that I believe is perhaps the most important. But we do an analysis with these four to kind of walk through it. And I'll say this is the first table of the first analysis of its kind on the topic. So, yeah. Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
Nationalist sentiment. If the Constitution outlaws and the nation, the modern nation, so to speak, outlaws untouchability, and untouchability, maybe my premises are wrong, but untouchability is something ancient, religious-based, pre-national. Why does nationalist sentiment correlate with, if I understood you right, high levels of untouchability?
One of the political parties which identify, yeah, one of the political parties is kind of like pushing all aspects of kind of everything that is ancient Indian essentialist is that which should be protected, and so as part of their political rhetoric, they are pushing that. So my sense of kind of nationalist sentiment is really a function of a national political party that pushes that agenda.
Hindu nationalism.
Yes, Hindu nationalism.
Right.
Yeah. Now, now how I measure Hindu nationalism, that's something different. Now, what I wanted was electoral data at the village by political party to get some sense of what was going on. There isn't a tremendous amount of variation, however, within Gujarat. And so then I started thinking, okay, alternatively, what's another way to actually get some sense of when the engine of Hinduism might be driven? And perhaps the area that is the most well studied within India, or about India, known about in the United States, concerns ethnic conflict. Hindu nationalist conflict. So I thought of, there's a riot database, which identifies instances of pro-Hindu nationalist sentiments rising to the point of violence. It might be that the amount of times that they take place, the number of killings that take place, the number of injuries that are involved in this might provide that kind of prompt. There was an arrest data, there was an arrest variable at the same time, the number of arrests that are conducted at these particular events, which basically fell into the model by mistake. I'll be perfectly honest. Because I was trying to capture this, the sentiment idea was kind of like, there's a riot that's concerning the Hindus. The Hindus would now be concerned with their identity. In that context of trying to protect their identity, one of the practices that is associated with that identity would be increased. Don't see it. Decreases. The explanation that I have for this is, well, actually at that moment, the Dalits aren't the ones that they're concerned with. It's the Muslims or the Sikhs. It's the group that they're having conflict with, that they're concerned with at the time, and thus in that context, you're less likely to engage in untouchability practices. Arrests, however, does increase it, and I'm actually thinking one of my topics is state repression and concerns organized capability of governments to engage in certain coercive activities. If your capacity is high, I argue then you have a higher capacity for engaging in arrests. Those places that do engage in more arrests find greater degrees of untouchability. So if the state can back you up in your social political practice of discrimination, then you're more likely to engage in that. Percent Hindu population, greater size of the population that is Hindu, which follows this issue of opportunity, capacity, and strength, greater degrees of untouchability. Then it was an issue of, okay, there's different ways of actually structuring some of the resource allocations, right? So you might have a tube well, it's the national sentiment. You might have a canal, you might have a tap. It's like, who knew taps mattered so much? You might have a tap, or you might have, from Oxfam, you might have a tube well, pump. Well, tube wells, taps, and canals increase untouchability. And part of the reason that I'm arguing for this is that they, in a sense, solidify or centralize the delivery of certain social services, which becomes easier to discriminate with. So one of the practices involved in untouchability concerns the fact that a Dalit cannot just walk up to a tap and just get some water. They actually have to have someone pour the water for them and then give it to them. By centralizing the distribution, you're actually facilitating the discriminatory practice itself. As opposed to the presence of a well, in a sense, I think that the well is a little bit more of a democratizing element than the more focused component of the tap or the canal. Or at least this is where I'm going with this. So, in terms of thinking about where we go or what we think about it, untouchability is a form of discrimination composed of various elements that are mutually reinforcing, and so strongly, in fact, that we're actually able to see a single index that is able to encompass all the different components. What explains this variation is increased by Hindu population, it's increased by state capacity measure, it's increased by various elements that centralize a mechanism of discrimination. It's decreased by kind of displaced hatred towards another group, and it's decreased by a more democratic distribution mechanism. What is not explained, this geographic proximity to the nearest town, that doesn't play out. Paved roads, muddy roads, percentage of the scheduled caste population, none of these factors have an impact. Now, in terms of where we go next, we're trying to get some measure of political participation, some sense of age of the population, age of the village, the degree of anti-untouchability activism. We need to expand the analysis past Gujarat. Part of the difficulty with being able to get this type of work done is that we needed individuals in 1,589 villages to actually get anything done. From Martin's organization, we basically had 200 individuals that we had trained numerous times to go out and engage in different types of data collection efforts. Those 200 partnered with the local person from Navsojan that was in each village. The network for that organization was required to do this type of work. There is no other organization like Navsojan that we've been able to identify to partner with in other states. Until the report came out that I showed you the cover of, that revealed that there was a couple of organizations that we weren't familiar with in Uttar Pradesh and Delhi that we're going to be working with now to kind of train to get this type of thing done. And we've been contacted by some other organizations as well to try to use the same exact procedure for measuring discrimination within their countries as well. And one of the biggest weaknesses of the piece is not consulting the non-Dalit population and getting their perspective with regards to what's going on. That is going to be a relatively large component of where we go. And questions?
Thank you. That was great. Floor is open, please.
I have a question. My sister and I are both Gujarati American, actually, and our parents grew up in Jamnagar and then went on to Ahmedabad for several years. So they grew up in the village of Jamnagar. And I'm wondering if there was any difference in terms of how Harijans or Dalits were treated in a place like Jamnagar, a smaller village, versus Ahmedabad.
Village size, we're just starting to kind of examine now. It's kind of related, however, in part to kind of like size of the population. So we think those type of factors are going to be there. I think what gets interesting though is the mechanism might be different, right? So smaller population, you might think that that leads or that lends itself towards a greater sense of potential for community. You might be a little bit less harsh. If things become a little bit more dispassionate, larger, that might lend itself towards more kind of a discrete division of labor and even more kind of hostility. What was interesting for me was we see a lot of the practices within, because there was an urban element to the story or the critique that people were giving, that this is just kind of this economically backward and kind of like isolated thing that takes place in villages but doesn't take place within urban context. And what you actually see is a different form of untouchability within urban context as well. So there's kind of a relatively decent discussion about its untouchability, so it's nasty. You should have expected something like this. But the removal of human feces is something that's done in rural context, and it's normally done with just a bowl and you're walking. I figured in the city that, okay, that couldn't be the case. But essentially, they're lowering Dalits into the sewer with a rope to clean things up. And so the same practices are basically being replicated in urban environments with their equivalents. And so some of the scaling up or kind of different impacts you'd find in different locations that I wasn't actually expecting, I was still finding. So I think that there'll be some kind of continuity, but maybe some substitutability that you see in, as you move across different sizes.
My question is about the legal angle. So it's against the law formally, but in your talk it's all about the practices and it's rampant. So is there any movement in the formal law? I mean, obviously after this report there was movement taken, but I mean, are there actions under these formal laws for that?
Actually, no. I mean, so every 10 years, there's a council that's convened to evaluate untouchability again, which basically they come up with some report, which is largely reliant upon police records, and whether or not you report to the police department is really another issue. And they use that data, so that's flawed and definitely an undercount. But basically, they're just like, oh, it's not gone yet. We need another 10 years. And then they kind of move on. And there's some lawsuits, though. So some of I mean, Martin is a lawyer as well. In his organization, there is a legal component to it. And they engage in lawsuits quite frequently. On the successful side, there's a lot of land that's supposed to be allocated for untouchables, and it's legally supposed to be allocated to them, but it's not always. And so they engage in legal struggles to get that land allocated for the relevant communities. And they had some success with like 20,000 acres, or the European equivalent, getting allocated. And so it's like there are some successes, there's more failures. And to get to the point of actually raising the legal challenge, you need a significant amount of infrastructure to get to that particular point and be able to sustain it over time. The strength of untouchability within India, however, is in part a function of the decentralization within the country. It's like every jurisdiction has got its own way of doing things, and thus in that situation of decentralization, it's hard to kind of navigate anything. And if it all starts from you being able to go to the local panchayat office or some political official to get something started, and they're biased against you, and you rarely can get outside of your village because of the economic situation, you have to worry about kind of like working and so forth, or you could run into somebody who's hostile to you as you're walking out of the village that could prevent you from going anywhere. I mean, so basically, to actually get to the point of advocacy takes a tremendous amount of kind of survival capabilities and resources that we kind of forget about in many respects here. It's like, right, you know, you make a phone call, ACLU, you get them, hey, there's a case over here, some journalist finds out. There, it's like you literally need to figure out, okay, for me to step outside of my block to go to some place that I've never been before could bring one of these untouchability practices. I mean, there's something about like, if you're approached by a particular upper caste, you're supposed to yield in a variety of different ways. If you don't, you could get beat there. And so it's like, if you add on to that all the things that you need to do to find out about the legal element. So a large part of Navsajan is to kind of communicate to people, hey, you have human rights. I mean, and there's some in that film. There's just some devastating pieces where these people are not. They're saying we're not even human. We don't deserve rights. I mean, that's like if that's where people are, the idea of getting to the legal thing is just kind of far for some of them.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very interesting. I'm wondering how you're dealing with, or if you're dealing with, how these things have been changing or not over time. So are you asking people about, so this year, has this been practiced in your village, or do you talk about throughout the history of this village, or how do you deal with that? Do people talk about things that happened in the past and report changes, or do they, are they sort of prompted to just talk about the current situation? What's your sense of, is it a good story, or is it same old, same old?
I mean, so there's, as I mentioned, there's 33 pages for the survey, the census. We ask about mostly contemporaneous problems, but we do have a component where we're asking about historical ones as well. I'm trying to find it, but I can't find it. The historical component is very interesting to the extent that we were interested in the resonance of prior activities and prior attacks. It's like, you know, how far back are people thinking about discriminatory practices that they'd associate with individual kind of discriminatory activities? And they were going back, you know, 40, 50 years, and so it was really amazing how far people were thinking back about things. So the census or survey that our work is closest to was conducted by this guy who died and his records were destroyed. The other person that does something that's kind of similar to ours was like 7, 8 years ago, but they did like maybe 3,000 people as opposed to what we did. So it's very difficult to get the cross-time bit, and whether or not we'll actually even be able to pull this off again, we're not quite clear on whether or not we'll be able to get a time series. And so it was kind of this trade-off. It's like, okay, do we try to get some insight into the practices now, or kind of think about the longer durée? But what we did was basically we embedded within the census instrument maybe 20 or 25 questions about kind of historical changes. I didn't talk about that here. We do have an element of it. And the ethnographic work, we ask about that all the time because, in a sense, how people are understanding the condition that they've been in and what people think or perceive to be the changes is kind of really important. By government records, things are getting better. But once you start getting to exactly how the records get to be created, then you really kind of question that. And I think that's the trajectory of untouchability. That's a huge problem.
excuse me, how did you pick the state of Gujarat as opposed to other states? Is that, do they have a higher percentage of elites, or which state would have the highest percentage?
I'm not sure which state has the highest percentage of Dalits. We picked Gujarat because that's where Martin's organization is based. And actually, Gujarat is biased against most of our hypotheses in the sense that it's one of the most developed states in India. And so going in, we would anticipate that we would not see as widespread the practices as possible. And when you start looking at kind of growth and economic development, you would not have expected this there. So seeing it there is actually a little bit stronger than what we'd anticipate in other locations, I think.
So for me, one of the takeaways from what you were saying was that there is a particular problem with either the state or external NGOs coming in and putting forth specific types of modernization efforts, right? Like building, not the well, but the other sources of water, concentrating in the proper ways. More broadly, what is the takeaway for addressing these types of issues from the perspective of, say, NGOs who are committed to development? What do you tell them?
I mean, so there's a couple of things actually. What I find useful is this issue of the kind of better contextualization of understanding how untouchability function. Like, I'm sorry, Kat left. One of the things that became clear was that anthropologists were part of a problem, in the sense that they were actually since they did not see overt manifestations of conflict, and I mean, you can imagine social scientists doing this, right? So not seeing overt manifestations of conflict and seeing that different parts of the population had direct allocations of, okay, well, you have the right to come back and beg at this household, and that counted as a job, and that since they weren't rebelling against that meant it was okay. And missed some of the kind of infrastructural things that that's Jim Scott would kind of lead us to kind of pay attention to. So there's a sensitization of kind of understanding what the dynamics are in a particular village and how they're kind of functioning. And I think if you were to better understand how untouchability functioned, then some of the Oxfam thing like programs, you wouldn't do some of them until you understood exactly how untouchability functioned in that locale. And so what might seem to be kind of an efficient mechanism of delivery layered into the principle of untouchability just leads to higher concentrations of an efficiency in discriminatory activities. I mean, I don't think Oxfam's thinking like that. I don't think like World Food Program is thinking about kind of how these programs interface with the local discriminatory situation and what you do about it. The other thing is kind of like, so Martin's organization engages in fasts and marches and information campaigns and so forth. So there's actually a lot of activism, and there has been for 3,000 years. There's been a lot of activism against untouchability. Those organizations don't generally kind of get partnered up with other institutions or get the kind of credibility or attention that they would otherwise get to get some understanding of what's going on. So I think part of this better understanding of kind of service delivery and so forth is kind of related to actually kind of where Liz was pushing us, which is just like there's money allocated for the creation of flush toilets all throughout India. Make sure that money gets to where it needs to get to. So you need to kind of embed an anti-corruption campaign with an accountability campaign, with an awareness-raising campaign, with an educational campaign to basically, I mean, if the kids don't think that they have rights, or grown women or grown men don't think that they have rights, and that they can't press those claims, that there's no agencies for them, that suggests that, you know, it's really hard. What do you do with that? I mean, so it's basically, I think you need to have a more kind of holistic and integrative thing that we talk about in terms of the kind of strategic peace building, but I think clearly there's multiple dimensions to the thing that need to be brought together in a way that we haven't been able to previously. But it's kind of necessitated this type of comprehensive, I think, approach to kind of cataloging all the different types of abuses and seeing how which one of those subsets of kind of caste discrimination could we get the most play on? So Professor Shaw, I can't pronounce his first name at the moment, he would focus in on kind of public service delivery. We should probably be best able to deal with public service delivery. That should be the one that we can have the biggest impact on, making sure that people can get onto a bus as a discriminatory practice. There's certain types of practices that are a little bit harder to deal with than others. So most people are able to get on buses in part because it's really hard to discriminate on the bus. Now, it's amazing how amorphous and powerful untouchability seems to be able to kind of manifest itself within the hierarchy of seats and so forth. But I think we still haven't got to the point to realize exactly how encompassing this thing is and how much of the society is influenced by it. But the minute you start going into India with any of these programs, you need to address that first and foremost, and that hasn't been a priority.
Some quick questions on the interview method. How big was the team? And were you all together doing all the interviews, or was it dispersed?
It was all dispersed. Basically, we had a male-female team in each village that partnered up with whoever the local Navsajan person was. And that enabled us so that if we were segregating by gender, then we had one that would go with each. The group ones, they were conducted together, so they would be there together. The team, while we had 200, the team was broken up into the male-female pairs that went everywhere. The village ones were a little bit, we were always kind of attentive to exactly who was running the meeting as a function of the size of the general population. So like if there was more women than men, then we let the women partner run it, and we were running those experiments too. It became fascinating in the same time because I was trying to study the study of untouchability while we were doing it. You could imagine Martin had a little bit less interest in that, but I was like, in order for us to make sure that our project can't be invalidated in different ways, we needed to be sensitive to these gender effects, to these age effects, and built that in. And I think I think that's one of the reasons why it took us a while. But the interviewer gender issue was something that we were really sensitive to. We didn't have enough play to kind of get some age and gender intersectionality issues going, but everything was in the local languages and local dialects.
People were translating for you?
Yeah. Yeah, so we have a version in Hindi. There's also other versions in the other dialects as well. Martin, because he's Martin and brilliant, developed. We have the census in a children's book. Martin created this book called Me and My Village, which is in, I think, 8 different languages, which basically has a little code sheet which you basically check for a discriminatory practice, and then you write in exactly what was going on, and then you mail it in. It was just like, it was brilliant. I was like, okay. And also, being Martin, you didn't realize he was doing it until he sent you 50, and so, go figure.
I wonder if there are any translation issues. Whenever there's a study done on, caste discrimination in India, I guess one of the things that I have trouble understanding is the translation. So, sometimes I struggle to find an English word for something that I know in Gujarati. Or when I speak with my parents, I don't understand what they're saying when they're describing a village practice. When my sister and I have gone to villages, we don't understand what's going on. So when you're forming your categories on, religious discrimination, for example, or even just general discrimination in the village, did you struggle with any issues with translation, even understanding what's going on, or finding the English equivalent, or finding the Gujarati equivalent when asking villagers for a certain practice?
This is why that part took like a year. Coming up with like this page. We have the Gujarati version, we have the English version, and then each one of these we would have translated and back translated in the local village we were in. It took forever. That someone would refer to the same exact practice in different ways, that also took forever. But so we had to map all of that stuff to basically figure out. What helped us was that no matter what they called that in the local location, there was at least 6 or 7 different versions of the thing, and we knew that was 37. And so we went through all these different versions of trying to figure out, okay, this is what the practice is, and then you describe the practice to them. And then we had there's a theatrical component, right? So that we had a little theater group that went to enact the 100 practices for people that weren't clear. It was like kind of the emergency social science mechanism of communication. Because we were just like, well, how do we communicate these practices to people that aren't quite clear? It's like, we can enact them. And so Martin found some actors, and then we tried to figure out exactly what they do, and then they started to enact the different kind of thing, and they're like, oh, you mean so-and-so. And that's what we end up putting in the cell. It's just, I want to write something about how the heck we pulled this off sometimes, because it's just like, we did what? A theater group connected with a research project, just go figure. I would never think that I would end up using a theater group, but my mom would be happy. So.
There's slang too, and
Yeah.
different dialects. So, because I know when my parents are speaking sometimes, or when my aunt will speak, they're completely different. It's the same practice they're talking about, but they refer to them in different ways because
Yeah.
one of them is from one village and the other one's from another.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why it worked out pretty well to have some of these communal things. So in the communal setting, someone would say no, but they were saying no to what they weren't clear about with regards to the practice. And then someone would be like, no, they mean this. And then they'd have this conversation. They say, oh, we refer to it as this way. So the collective thing actually ended up being kind of interesting because they ended up working a lot of these out. We only transcribed like maybe 50 of the sessions, and I couldn't believe some of the stuff that came up. And then, of course, they'd have a break. And then the break would be a couple of hours, and they'd reconvene, and then there'd be a meal, and then someone have some crisis. And some woman she gave birth in one of them, which was just. But I'm sure that was easily translated, though. Christine?
Just 3 quick clarification questions. Did you compensate people for their time?
No.
Okay. And then, just out of curiosity, why did the household survey break down? And then, why are wells more democratic?
The household thing broke down because I don't think, even after we clarified what was going on, you go in and you talk to everyone in the household. Even though we went over that for years, I don't think they actually got it until they started to go into households and they started to do it and realized there's 8 people in this household. There's 12 people in this household. There's 15 in this household. And they start adding them up, and they're just like, we just can't keep doing this. So.
Like it was too many.
It was too many people. It was too many people. It was taking too much time. They were just, so we had, I mean, at no point in time did we discuss cash. This was something the organization wanted to do, and I'm consultant, and so I can't push anything. And everyone was very committed to the project. And so in that context, my methodological quibbles were kind of sidestepped every now and then. Be like, okay, we are here. And so we just kind of came into this kind of problem. But then we came to this point where we were realizing, like, once I realized, hey, we randomized the treatment anyway, I'm good. Then I was fine, but you know, I wanted the rest of my end, but they wouldn't comply. The well thing I'm still thinking about, right? So wells are physically larger than taps. Canals are directed from one body of water to another, and I think, in a sense, more easily policed, and they're always moving through some other wealthy individual's property, and so I think they're able to kind of regulate it as well. I think it comes down to kind of the policing mechanism. So there's something about wells and where they're placed that's allowing a different type of policing mechanism than for taps and for canals. That's just speculation at the moment, though.
Any other questions for Christian at this point? Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.